We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
There are some puzzling new developments tonight in the ongoing search for Nancy Guthrie.
Most people think they understand what happened that night. They believe the key moment came sometime after 2 a.m. when Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. A sudden event, a brief window, someone arrives, something happens, and within minutes, she is gone. That is the version that has been repeated since the beginning. But when investigators started putting the timeline together, minute by minute, they noticed something different. The events of that night did not happen all at once. They unfolded over time. And when you look closely at the period between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m., what emerges is not a single moment, but a sequence, one that stretches across more than 4 hours, a sequence that begins quietly and ends with a signal that simply stops. Let's start at the last moment everything appeared normal. January 31st, 2026, just before 10 p.m. Before we get into the timeline, secure your sit by liking and subscribing to support this channel for bringing these videos to you. According to reports, Nancy Guthrie returns home after spending the evening with family. She is 84 years old, living alone in the Catalina Foothills area outside Tucson, Arizona. At approximately 9:50 p.m., her garage door closes. That timestamp matters because it is the final confirmed record of her safely entering the home. From that point forward, there are no visitors reported, no unusual calls, no alerts. According to investigators, everything appears quiet. Now for the next several hours, there is very little activity recorded, and that in itself is not unusual. Nancy Guthrie was known to keep a routine. Family members say she typically settled in for the night not long after returning home. Lights off, doors secured, phone nearby. According to investigators, there is no indication of disturbance during this early period, which brings us to the next key point in the timeline. 1:47 a.m. This is the moment the front door camera stops working. According to law enforcement, the device did not fail on its own. It appears to have been physically interfered with. That detail is important because it suggests the presence of someone outside the home at that exact time. Close enough to reach the camera, close enough to disable it directly. Up until 1:47 a.m., there is no confirmed sign of anyone else on the property. At 1:47 a.m., that changes. Now here's where things begin to shift. Because if this were a simple, fast-moving situation, and you might expect everything to happen quickly from that point forward. But that is not what the timeline shows. Instead, the next confirmed event does not occur until 2:12 a.m. That is a gap of 25 minutes. 25 minutes between the camera going dark and the next recorded movement. Now investigators have said that a motion sensor on the property was triggered at 2:12 a.m. The exact location of that sensor has not been publicly specified, but it was enough to confirm that someone was moving on or near the property at that time. So we have 2 points now. 1:47 a.m., camera disabled, 2:12 a.m., motion detected, and in between those two moments, there is no confirmed footage, but there is a span of time where something was happening. Now here's where things get complicated, because within that same window, what investigators believe there may have been activity inside the house as well. As reported, Nancy Guthrie's landline phone shows signs of use during the early morning hours. The exact timing has not been fully released, but sources indicate it falls within this broader time frame. That introduces a different kind of detail, because a landline is not something that operates in the background. It requires action. Someone has to pick it up. Someone has to dial or answer. And if that interaction happened after 1:47 a.m., then it places activity inside the home at the same time someone was outside disabling the camera. That is not a small detail. It suggests overlap. Now, we do not yet know who interacted with the phone. Investigators have not confirmed whether it was an outgoing call, an incoming call, or an incomplete attempt. But the presence of that record adds another layer to the timeline. It tells us that during this period, the situation may not have been immediate or uninterrupted. There may have been moments where something paused, moments where decisions were made. Then there's another piece of information that has drawn attention: Nancy Guthrie's mobile phone. According to investigators, it was found inside the home the following morning. It had not been taken. That matters because in many cases involving removal or transport, A phone is either taken or intentionally disabled. In this case, it remained where it was, which means any communication that happened during that window would have had to involve something else, like the landline. Now let's move forward in the timeline. 2:12 a.m., motion detected, and then, we're 16 minutes later, another critical moment, 2:28 a.m. This is when Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stops communicating with her phone. At first, that might sound like a technical detail, but according to investigators, it is one of the most precise timestamps in the entire case. Because unlike cameras or sensors, a medical device records internal data. It reflects what is happening inside the body. And when that signal ends, it marks a very specific point in time. Now here's the central issue investigators have been working through. If Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home and moved somewhere else, the expectation would be that her condition and the device monitoring it would continue to record beyond that point. Even if the phone connection was lost, the device itself would still function. But according to reports, the data associated with that final moment does not clearly indicate continued activity beyond 2:28 a.m. And that raises a question. Was that moment the beginning of something, or was it the end? Then there's this detail. When investigators line up all of the known timestamps, they form a sequence that looks less like a sudden event and more like a progression. 9:50 p.m., garage door closes. 1:47 a.m., camera disabled. Sometime after that, possible landline activity. 2:12 a.m., motion detected. 2:28 a.m., pacemaker signal ends. 5 points in time, spread across more than 4 hours, and within that sequence, the most critical activity is concentrated in a 41-minute window. Now, it is important to stay grounded here. Investigators have not publicly confirmed a final interpretation of this timeline. The case remains open. The FBI and local authorities continue to review evidence and follow leads. But they have made one thing clear. Understanding what happened between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. is essential, because that is where the timeline narrows. That is where the known data points begin to overlap. And that is where the sequence of events becomes most defined. In the next part, we are going to walk through that 41-minute window in more detail. Not just the timestamps, but what investigators and experts say those moments could represent when viewed together. Because once those details are placed side by side, the timeline begins to tell a more complete story, not just of when things happen, but how they may have unfolded step by step. Now let's slow this down and walk through that 41-minute window more carefully. Because once you move beyond the headline timestamps and begin looking at how those moments connect, the timeline starts to feel more structured. Not a single event, but a sequence with distinct stages. We begin again at 1:47 a.m. This is the moment the front door camera stops working. According to investigators, the device appears to have been physically interfered with. That means someone was close enough to reach it, close enough to interact with it directly. Now, in many cases, disabling a camera is the first step. It removes visibility, it creates a blind spot. But what matters here is what happens next. Because after 1:47 a.m., nothing else is immediately recorded. There is no instant motion alert, no immediate follow-up signal. Instead, there is a gap, and that gap lasts approximately 25 minutes. Now here's where things get complicated. During those 25 minutes, investigators believe there may have been activity inside the house. As mentioned earlier, landline records suggest that the phone was used, or at least handled, sometime during this broader window. While the exact minute has not been publicly confirmed, analysts have placed it between the camera going offline and the motion sensor being triggered. That places the landline interaction within those same 25 minutes. Now consider what that means. If someone disabled the camera at 1:47 a.m. and the landline was used shortly after, then there was a period of time where events inside the home were unfolding before any recorded movement outside was detected. That suggests the situation did not move immediately from entry to removal. There may have been interaction, a conversation, a confrontation, or an attempt to contact someone. Now, we do not know who used the phone. Investigators have not confirmed whether it was Nancy Guthrie or someone else. But the presence of that activity introduces a pause in the sequence, a moment where something happened that required time. Then we move forward to 2:12 a.m. This is when the motion sensor is triggered, According to reports, the sensor detected movement somewhere on the property. The exact position has not been publicly specified, but it confirms that by this point, someone was moving outside or near the home. Now place that in context. If the camera was disabled at 1:47 a.m. and motion is not detected until 2:12 a.m., then whatever happened between those 2 points may have taken place largely inside the house. That is a key observation because it suggests that the first 25 minutes of this sequence were not about movement away from the property. They were about what was happening within it. Now let's move to the final point. 2:28 a.m. This is when Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stops communicating with her phone. And according to investigators, this is one of the most precise timestamps available. Because unlike motion sensors or cameras, which can miss or fail, a medical device records internal data continuously. So when that signal ends, it marks a very specific moment. Now here's where analysts begin to look at the pattern. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:12 a.m., there is a period of likely indoor activity. From 2:12 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., there is confirmed movement on the property, and at 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker signal ends. That creates two distinct phases, an initial phase inside the house and a later phase involving movement outside. Now that structure matters because it does not align neatly with a rapid, uninterrupted abduction. Instead, it suggests that the situation developed in stages. Now let's consider another detail. Investigators have confirmed that Nancy Guthrie's blood was found near the entrance of her home. They have not provided a full description, but they have acknowledged its presence. And that detail becomes more meaningful when placed within this timeline. Because if the initial interaction occurred inside the home and movement was detected later outside, then the location of that evidence may help anchor where certain events took place, near the door, between the inside and the outside. Now here's something else investigators have had to consider: the condition of the home itself. According to reports, there was no clear sign of forced entry publicly confirmed. That does not rule it out, but it does mean there was no obvious damage that immediately indicated a break-in. That raises a possibility that the door may have been opened, either willingly or under some form of pressure. And if that is the case, then the interaction between Nancy Guthrie and whoever was outside may not have started with immediate force. It may have started with contact. Now let's return briefly to the pacemaker, because the timing of that final signal is critical. If the device stopped communicating at 2:28 a.m., and if, as some reports suggest, the data leading up to that moment reflects a significant change, then that timestamp becomes more than just a technical endpoint. It becomes a marker, a point where something reached a conclusion. Now, to be clear, investigators have not publicly confirmed the exact interpretation of that data. They have not stated definitively what occurred at that moment, but they have continued to examine it closely. Because when you align that timestamp with everything else, the camera, the landline, the motion sensor, it sits at the end of the sequence, not the beginning. And that distinction matters because it suggests that by 2:28 a.m., whatever was happening had already progressed through its earlier stages. Now let's bring in one more element: NAS time itself. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., we are looking at 41 minutes. 41 minutes is not a brief moment. It is long enough for multiple actions, long enough for a situation to change direction more than once. And when investigators analyze timelines like this, they often look for exactly that. Points where something begins, points where something shifts, and points where something ends. In this case, those points appear to be clearly marked: camera disabled, possible phone interaction, movement detected, signal ends. 4 steps, 1 sequence. In the next part, we are going to step back and look at what this sequence might mean when viewed as a whole. Not just the individual timestamps, but how they interact with each other. Because when investigators connect these details with the broader evidence, the ransom messages, the lack of confirmed sightings, and the absence of proof of life, the focus of the case begins to shift. Not just toward what happened during those 41 minutes, but toward what likely did not happen after them. Now let's step back and look at the full sequence. Because when investigators reach this point in a case, the goal is not just to list events, it is to understand how those events connect. What came first? what changed, and what likely happened by the end. So let's walk through it one more time as a complete timeline. January 31st, 2026. At approximately 9:50 p.m., Nancy Guthrie arrives home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson. Her garage door closes, and according to investigators, that is the last confirmed moment everything appears normal. For the next several hours, there is no recorded disturbance. Then early the next morning, February 1st, at 1:47 a.m., the front door camera is disabled. Investigators say it appears to have been physically interfered with. That suggests someone was at the door, must close enough to reach the device. That is the first sign that something has changed. Then comes a gap, a period of time with no recorded motion outside. But within that same window, there is likely activity inside the home. Landline records indicate that the phone was used, or at least handled, sometime after 1:47 a.m. and before 2:12 a.m. We do not know exactly who used it. We do not know whether it was an outgoing call, an incoming call, or an incomplete attempt. But we do know that it happened during that same critical period. Now here's why that matters, because it suggests that the situation inside the home did not move immediately from contact to removal. There was time for interaction, time for something to unfold. Then at 2:12 a.m., a motion sensor detects movement on the property. This is the first confirmed sign of activity outside after the camera was disabled, and it comes 25 minutes after that initial point of contact. So whatever happened between 1:47 a.m. and 2:12 a.m. likely occurred inside or very close to the home. Then 16 minutes later at 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stops communicating with her phone, and that moment stands out because unlike the other data points, which record movement or external activity, this one reflects something internal. It marks a specific point in time that cannot be adjusted or reinterpreted easily. Now, when investigators look at this sequence as a whole, they begin to see a pattern, not a single fast-moving event, but a progression, contact at the door, activity inside the house, movement on the property, and a final moment at 2:28 a.m. Or 4 stages, all within 41 minutes. Now here's the central issue. Does that pattern match what most people initially believed? The widely accepted narrative has been that Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in a kidnapping. That assumption was reinforced by the ransom messages that followed, messages demanding $6 million in Bitcoin and including details about her home. But when investigators compare that narrative to the timeline, there are points that do not fully align. Because in most ransom cases, especially those involving elderly victims, the process tends to be quick. Entry, control, removal. The longer someone remains at the scene, the greater the risk. But in this case, there is a prolonged period of activity. There is landline interaction. There is a delay before movement is detected outside. And there is a defined endpoint at 2:28 a.m. Now let's connect that with another detail. Investigators have said there is no publicly confirmed evidence showing Nancy Guthrie leaving the property. There has been no released footage of her being transported, no confirmed sightings placing her anywhere after that night. That does not mean it did not happen, but it does mean there is no verified record of it. And when that absence is placed alongside the timeline, it becomes more difficult to map a clear path from the house to somewhere else. Then there's the issue of proof of life. In cases involving ransom demands, it is common for those responsible to provide some form of confirmation that the person is still alive. A phone call, a message, a recording, something that establishes ongoing contact. According to public reports, no confirmed proof of life has been provided in Nancy Guthrie's case. That absence has been noted by investigators. Now again, this does not prove anything on its own, but when it is considered alongside the timeline, it becomes part of a larger picture. Because if a critical event occurred at or around 2:28 a.m., and if there is no verified evidence of life after that point, then the sequence may not extend beyond those 41 minutes in the way it was first believed. Now, it is important to stay careful here. Investigators have not publicly confirmed a final conclusion. They have not ruled out abduction. They have not announced charges. The case remains open, and they continue to review evidence, including forensic samples and digital record. But they have made it clear that the timeline is central. Because unlike statements or assumptions, the timeline is built from recorded data, camera logs, phone records, medical device signals. Each one marks a moment that cannot be changed. And when those moments are placed in order, they begin to show how the situation developed. Not all at once, but step by step. For Nancy Guthrie's family, those steps represent the last known record of her life, the final hours inside her home, the final minutes investigators are still trying to understand. And for those following the case, the question remains, when you look at this timeline as a whole, does it support the original belief of what happened? Or does it suggest that the events of that night unfolded in a different way? If you have been following closely, I would be interested to hear your thoughts. Do you think the minute-by-minute timeline changes how this case should be understood? And if you would like to continue following updates and careful breakdowns like this, you can subscribe and stay with us. For now, the answers remain within those 41 minutes, and investigators are still working to understand exactly what they reveal. There is one more way investigators often approach a timeline like this. After laying out each event, after comparing every timestamp, they ask a simpler question. If this sequence is accurate, what does it rule out? Because sometimes understanding what likely did not happen is just as important as understanding what did. Let's start with movement. If Nancy Guthrie had been taken quickly and transported away from the home, investigators would expect to see a tighter sequence, a shorter window between contact and departure. But instead, there is that 25-minute gap after 1:47 a.m. And during that gap, there are signs of possible activity inside the house. That does not fully align with a rapid removal. Then there's communication. If this were an active ransom situation, there would usually be early direct contact. Why something that confirms the person is alive and establishes control. But according to public reports, that kind of communication did not happen. The messages that were received came later, and they did not include confirmed proof of life. Now that does not rule anything out completely, but it does limit how confidently that scenario fits the timeline. Then there's the final moment, 2:28 a.m., when the pacemaker signal ends. That point is fixed, and because it is tied to a medical device, it carries a different level of weight than other types of data. Investigators cannot easily move that moment earlier or later. It sits exactly where it is, and when they look at everything leading up to it, they have to account for it. Now here's where the timeline becomes less about theory and more about structure. Because regardless of interpretation, the sequence shows a beginning, a middle, and an end. A beginning at 1:47 a.m. when the camera is disabled. A middle period involving possible interaction inside the house and movement on the property. And an end at 2:28 a.m. when the pacemaker signal stops. That structure is difficult to ignore. Now, what happened within that structure is still under investigation. There are still unanswered questions. Who was at the door? Who interacted with the landline? What exactly occurred between 2:12 a.m. and 2:28 a.m.? Those details matter, and they are still being examined. But the framework itself, the sequence of events, is one of the clearest parts of the case. And that is why investigators continue to return to it. Because in situations like this, where direct evidence is limited, the timeline often becomes the most reliable guide. It does not depend on memory. It does not change over time. It simply records what happened, one moment after another. Now there is something else worth considering. Time in cases like this can feel very different depending on how it is viewed. 41 minutes can sound brief when you say it out loud, but when you break it down minute by minute, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes long enough for multiple interactions, long enough for a situation to shift more than once, long enough for something to begin one way and end another. And that is what makes this timeline so important, because it shows that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie was not confined to a single instant. It unfolded, step by step, moment by moment. As of now, investigators continue to review all available evidence. They are examining forensic material, digital records, and any new information that comes in. They have also continued to ask for public assistance, noting that even small details can help clarify a sequence like this. For Nancy Guthrie's family, that timeline is not just a series of timestamps. It represents the final record of her night, the last confirmed moments inside her home, and the window where answers may still be found. If you have followed this case from the beginning, You have now seen how that night unfolded from 9:50 p.m. to 2:28 a.m. Not as a single event, but as a sequence. And as more information becomes available, that sequence may become even clearer, or it may raise new questions. For now, it remains the closest thing investigators have to a complete picture, and it is still being studied, 1 minute at a time. If you have your own thoughts after looking at the full timeline, you are not alone. Do you think the sequence points clearly in one direction? Or do you see parts of it that still do not fully connect? And if you would like to continue following careful, step-by-step breakdowns like this, you can subscribe and stay with us. Because in cases like this, understanding the timeline is often the first step toward understanding the truth. At this point, everything comes back to one place, the house. Because no matter how the timeline is interpreted, every confirmed detail begins there and in many ways remains there. The garage closes at 9:50 p.m. The camera is disabled at 1:47 a.m. There is likely activity inside the home shortly after. Movement is detected on the property at 2:12 a.m. and at 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker signal ends. Every one of those moments is tied to that location. And that is why investigators continue to focus so closely on what happened inside and immediately around that home. Now, when cases remain unresolved, there is often a tendency to look outward, to imagine where someone may have been taken, where they might be, or what could have happened after they left. But in this situation, much of the available evidence points in the opposite direction. Back to the beginning, back to the timeline inside that 41-minute window. Because if the sequence we have walked through is accurate, then the most critical moments did not happen somewhere else. They happened there, inside the home, or just steps outside of it. Now, that does not provide all the answers. There are still questions investigators are working through. The identity of the person at the door, the exact nature of the interaction inside the house, what occurred between 2:12 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., and whether there are additional pieces of evidence that have not been made public. Those details matter, and they are likely what will eventually determine how this case is resolved. But the structure of the timeline gives investigators a starting point. Now, it narrows the focus. It reduces the number of possibilities that fit all of the known facts. And in cases like this, that narrowing is important because it allows investigators to test each possibility against the same set of fixed points. Now, let's consider something simple. If new information comes in, whether it is a tip, a piece of forensic evidence, or a recorded sighting, it has to fit within this timeline. It has to align with the established sequence. If it does not, then it has to be questioned. That is how timelines are used in investigations, not just to understand what happened, but to evaluate what could have happened. Now, as of today, there have been no arrests, no confirmed location, and no official statement that resolves what occurred during those final minutes. But the timeline remains unchanged and still central to the investigation. For Nancy Guthrie's family, that means the most important answers are still tied to that night, still tied to those hours between 9:50 p.m. and 2:28 a.m., and still tied to the details investigators continue to examine. For those following the case, it also means something else. That understanding what happened does not come from a single piece of information. It comes from how those pieces connect, how they align, and how they hold together when placed in order. Because when the timeline is clear, the path forward often becomes clearer as well. It may not provide immediate answers, but it defines where those answers are most likely to be found. And in this case, that place has remained the same from the beginning: the house, the sequence, the 41 minutes that changed everything. As more information becomes available, investigators will continue to test it against that framework. And over time, that framework may become more complete, or it may shift as new details emerge. But for now, it stands as the most consistent record of what is known. If you have followed this entire breakdown, you have seen how each piece fits into that sequence, from the quiet return home at 9:50 p.m. to the final recorded moment at 2:28 a.m., and everything in between. Now, I would like to leave you with a simple question. When you look at the timeline as a whole, what stands out to you the most? Is it the gap between 1:47 a.m. and 2:12 a.m.? Is it the landline activity? Or is it that final moment at 2:28 a.m.? Each of those points carries weight, and each one plays a role in how this case is understood. If you would like to continue following updates and careful step-by-step breakdowns like this, you can subscribe and stay with us. Because in cases like this, the details matter. And sometimes it is the smallest detail that brings everything into focus.